Off you go.
All right, so hi, I'm James Lindner. I'm one of the family proprietors here at Langmeil Winery.
And I'm Jonathan Bitter, sort of family, indirectly, we won't get into that. Been at Langmeil basically since its inception, so it's a place of love and passion for me. Everyone here is family in one respect or another, and a great place to come to work each day. Yeah. We love to share the history of Langmeil, because Langmeil is part of the earliest European history, not only in the Barossa but in the state of South Australia. So our name Langmeil is a German derivative from a village that was here originally, and it was the village of the Long Mile in English translation, if you like. And that was the second of the little German Lutheran villages that were established in the Barossa. I can go back to why there were Germans in the Barossa to start with if you want to know, but South Australia differs to the other states of Australia in that the other states were originally penal colonies and South Australia wasn't. South Australia was almost a utopian ideal, if you like. It was a group of English businessmen that got together and petitioned the British government to establish a new, well, they didn't even call it a colony, to differentiate from the penal colonies, they called it a province. So the province of South Australia, which would be an opportunity for free settlers to take up land and make a life for themselves. And when we say free, those freedoms, it wasn't just that there weren't convicts here, it's that people would enjoy freedoms that we take for granted in the modern era. Things like freedom of political expression and freedom of religious expression. And without going into too much detail, at the same time as this new English province was being formed, in Europe, the country of Germany that we now know by its current borders didn't yet exist. Germany was yet to be unified, so it was different states and territories. And as territories, they had an emperor, they had a Kaiser, which was Kaiser Wilhelm at the time, and they were pushing towards nationhood. So this is in the 1830s. South Australia was settled in 1836. So in terms of the Germanic states, one of the things that the then Kaiser Wilhelm did was he recognised that religion was often the cause of or the excuse for conflict. So he was trying to eliminate that as a factor in unification. So he formed a new church. It wasn't a new faith, it was Christianity, but that's practiced in lots of different ways. So he thought if we can get everyone in these different territories singing from the same hymn sheet, so to speak, get them on the same page, that would help bring everyone together. So this new church was called, as the name implies, the Unionist Church. The name was to unify people. What he didn't count on was that in terms of those Germanic states, up in the northeast, in terms of present-day map, most of it Germany, a little bit of it Poland, if you can picture that on the map, that area of Prussia was home to a lot of Lutherans. Now, the Lutheran Church, several hundred years earlier than what we're talking about now, during the Reformation, they'd fought very long and hard to break away from the Catholic Church. And they suffered a lot of persecution in the process. So several hundred years later, old wounds are obviously running deep, because when they got told that you're not going to be Lutherans anymore, you're now Unionists, here's your new prayer book, here's how things are going to work, they didn't take too kindly to that and they refused to change. And because they refused to change, that was viewed as an impediment to nationhood. So they started to become quite persecuted again. So they were pretty keen to get out of Prussia/Germany and go somewhere where they had freedom of faith. And they went all over the place. Quite a few went to the US. You'll find plenty of Lutherans in America. Some went to Russia. That didn't work out too well longer term for them. But one particular Lutheran minister called Pastor Carvel, who incidentally is buried a long mile from us here down the other end of the village of Langmeil in the Langmeil Lutheran Cemetery. He actually went to England trying to find somewhere to take his persecuted flock. And when he arrived in England, he was put in touch with a gentleman called George Fife Angus, who was the chairman of the South Australian Company. It was a private company that had been formed with the charter to help establish this new province. And to Angus, he saw that this is exactly what they were talking about. These are the founding principles of this new province. These were just good, stoic, God-fearing, hard-working people, wanted somewhere to go and settle, make a life for themselves where they would be free to practice their faith and their faith was their whole life. They were peasant farmers. They didn't have the means to pack up and move halfway around the world. They didn't have the means to prepay for land as the other settlers were. So Angus sponsored them out of his own pocket. He chartered 4 ships initially to help bring them out here. He set them up on the land. In return, they worked the land and they paid off their debt with produce. So a lot of them settled through the Adelaide Hills. A lot moved into the Barossa Valley. And in terms of the Barossa, there were certainly English settlers and things here too. But some of these people kept not only to their own nationality, they kept their own little Lutheran congregations. So you had little congregational villages. And the first 2 of those in the Barossa were Bethany, which is just the other side of the township of Tanunda, and the one on the other side of that township of Tanunda, Langmeil. So Tanunda wasn't there at that point. Bethany and Langmeil were both established in 1842, and the township of Tanunda grew up between the 2 of them. So it was a thriving metropolis of 12 families originally, spread along the river. South Australia is the driest state of the driest continent outside of Antarctica. So water was really important. And so these little farmlets is what they were. They operated under what was called the Hoofendorf system. So a hoof is a small farming allotment, dorf meaning village, so small farming village. And Langmeil was one road. It ran parallel to the river, the North Para. And if you'd come along that road in the time of the village, you'd have found 12 hoofs, which were relatively narrow but deep farming allotments stretching from the road back to the river. And where we sit now, as the winery of Langmeil, was at one end of the village. That river takes a 90-degree turn over in the corner of the property. So that bordered the property on 2 sides. It brought the village to an end. And of the 12 families, the most significant to us was a family called the Aurichts, because they occupied the land that we sit on today. The patriarch of the family at the time was Christian Auricht. He was the village blacksmith as well as being a farmer, so hence you'll find the old blacksmith shop and things on the property here. But like all the others, he planted varied mixed crops, and quite indicative of how these little hoofs work. He had a few acres of some fruit trees, a few acres of some cereal grains, had a few livestock, and he planted vines. And that's where you find the humble beginnings of the wine industry in the Barossa. Small-scale peasant farmers planting various crops. And within those 12 families, Christian wasn't the only to plant vines. 7 of the 12 planted vineyard. But over time, families start to specialise. Some became cereal grain farmers. A lot of them became orchardists. There was a very strong orchard and dried fruit industry in the Barossa. But some chose to focus on their vines. And fortunately for us, Christian Auricht did. And our great privilege here on the property of Langmeil is that in addition to all the beautiful old buildings and things that survive, we've still got a few acres of Christian's original planted vines. So that's the humble beginnings of how the name arose, how the village came to be, and the beginnings of the wine industry. But as the Barossa still operates today, there's 160 odd wineries, from the really big ones to the little ones that people will never hear the names of, unfortunately. And I say unfortunately because they make exceptional wine, but they're often doing it just for themselves, very small scale. But there are some nearly 600 odd growing families. So there's a lot of people make their living just growing grapes and selling to wineries. And that's how the Auricht family operated in the early years. There was no commercial winery on the property for 90 years. So generations of the Aurichts continued to tend those vines and just grow the fruit and sell it up until 1932. And that's when the first commercial winery was established on the property. And then we start to get into winemaking families, if you want to talk about those, James.
Yeah. Maybe we can pause there for a minute.
That was incredible.
But that's the stuff I love too. Like every time I hear John talk to that, it just rekindles the fact that we all start from somewhere, and when you're thinking people are travelling halfway around the world for a fresh new beginning. Bringing family over, there's many a tragic story on just getting here, that first initial journey. And then you look back and we're now, 6 or 7 generations, from that first original sort of migration out of sort of like Prussia or / Germany, and to find that new beginning. And really when you think of the Barossa, even though, we've been growing grapes and making wine for like 180 years, the Barossa is still a very young story in the wine world for some people. And so I suppose for us, as the sixth generation, of the Lindner family who were on, one of those early boats and actually settled in the village of Langmeil back in, the 1840s, I suppose it's one of our jobs, I suppose, is to make sure that, all that effort and, of generations to build something, like the region, its community, and then its agricultural base. I suppose for us, it's just continuing on building from that legacy. So the Lindner family were part of the first sort of European settlers to the village of Langmeil. Jonathan mentioned Bethany. There's numerous villages or parishes, there's around 30 of them across the district. And so the Lindner family really started out from our means more around butcher. That was a lot of their original livelihoods were butchers. So leading up to our father, there are 4 generations of Lindners were butchers and really small goods producers. So, they very much brought those food traditions, of smoked meats and certain be it bloodwurst and white pudding and all this. So, it's interesting why we always talk about wine in the Barossa. There is a very long and cherished sort of past in food and preserves and pickles and all this sort of stuff. So so that was really the Lindner family sort of origins. There's a rich history in that, lots of different stories of where the families and the channels have sort of gone off on different tangents to one becoming the mayor of a small town called Green Hills in Ohio. And then, often they branch out. And so for us, I suppose the Lindner family from our sort of branch of so our sort of father, had left the region, as often many children do, to pursue sort of a career and to get out into the world, and then eventually sort of found love, came back to the Barossa and to raise his 2 boys, which is myself, James, and then my older brother Paul. We often talk about genetics and everything. If there's one gene I think the Lindner family have is this inherent gene to actually attract ourselves to things that need refixing. It's sort of like, oh my God, look at that, we need to go and fix that. So for us, the Lindner family, we came across this property in 96, and it was very much a property that was incredibly derelict, like run down, because it didn't really get through the 1980s and no one wanted to spend any money on it. The whole place was collapsing, and these are buildings from the beginning of the European settlement to the region. And I jokingly say, people come to purchase the property and they walk through and they just went like, holy shit, like look at this place, And then our family came through and we went like, holy shit, like look at this place. And it's really been a money sink. So, but slowly we brought it back to life, and over the last sort of 30 odd years, it's sort of like creating a place, I suppose, that people can come to, immerse themselves in very much the beginnings of the Barossa, while enjoying the wines that are our pursuit, and particularly my brother Paul, who makes all of our wines. Really his pursuit in fine wine endeavours, and something that we can obviously take to a world, market where people can look at what Barossa can do, from the lessons we've learnt from the past and shaping wines, that'll create our future.
Great.
I should touch base a little bit on Paul's story because, Paul left the Barossa in the 80s because there wasn't a future in wine. And so as a lot of that sort of generation, I often refer to them as a lost generation, they went and pursued other paths. And my brother actually went on to become like a diesel mechanic. And he did that for years. And I don't know if it was part of destiny or what, but when you sort of end up inheriting a very old property that's been run down for such a long time, having a mechanical background is excellent because you can fix everything up, right? And so that's what he did. So he found love and then moved back to the Barossa and, wanted to start, restart a life back home amongst this community, his friends. And eventually, actually it was Paul that suggested to my dad and our uncle Chris and my dad's cousin Carl to maybe investigate the old winery on this property, because at that stage they were looking at building a new winery. So it was really his sort of planting the seed of coming to have a look at this place in the first instance. So anyway, so Paul worked for Orlando, and they put him through what was a secondary, like a TAFE course, from the vine to the wine, and he genuinely was interested. He actually was running the crusher there, and during the day, and then during the night he was making wine in his back shed, because he just felt like this was interesting. And I always find it funny because he would do vintage during the day, and then he'd do a vintage at night, and then when his mates started learning that he was making wine in the shed, people started rocking up and so on. And in fact, it was one of his what he would call his shed reds. And he took it over to a dinner. He was invited by a son of Peter Lehman, famous Barossa wine producer and community advocate, and they sat around the kitchen table, and Paul proudly brought out his 96 shed red and to share, and Peter just went, "Holy shit, Paul, like if you can make wine like this in your back shed, I think you've got a great future as a winemaker." And that was that little extra spark. Sometimes it's that little third party endorsement that just sort of gives you that little bit of confidence to move forward. And that's what happened. And so when we purchased this property back in 96, Paul left his job, came to work for the property, and really started to fix it up, clean it up. And he's very meticulous. And this is, if you're a winemaker, that is a pretty good thing. Meticulous is good. And so when it came to the old vine, initially we did have a consultant winemaker, because Paul had never studied oenology. It was the school of winemaking in his back shed, and often being able to talk to other knowledgeable people within the district to share their knowledge, which they're always open to do. And anyway, after the first vintage, my brother went to our dad and our uncle and just said, "Look, I really think I can make a better wine than this consultant. I'd really like the opportunity." And if there's one word that Dad taught both of us, it was the word persistence, right? So Paul just wouldn't let this go. He said, come on. And eventually they go, "All right, look, you can make the wine from the old vines, right?" He said, "All right, cool, that's all I want." And so the 98 Freedom, he made that. And then 2 years later, it was entered into the Barossa Wine Show, and it ended up winning the best Shiraz in the Barossa Wine Show, the trophy. And then I think our dad and our uncle said, "Okay, Paul, you can make all the wines from now on."
Jonathan, so you were explaining earlier that in around 1842 these communities were settled. Can you talk more about that in reference to the 1843, just a year later, Freedom Shiraz Vineyard? And maybe start to introduce that vineyard a bit more.
Yeah, sure. So Christian Auricht, the first property holder here, these people had far more pressing needs than the establishment of a wine industry. Interestingly, that South Australian company that was helping the development of the province of South Australia, and again that gentleman George Angus, he had employed the services of a gentleman called Johann Mengi, another German, who was referred to as South Australia's first geologist or mineralogist. He was quite a quirky character. He's there in the record books, but there's not a lot of statues and things to him because he managed to offend everyone. But what I love about Mengi, wine is all things to all people, but for me personally, wine is very connecting. It's about dirt. It's about geography, climate and soil. And Mengi, as a geologist, recognised the potential of the Barossa as an agricultural region. And he didn't just wander through. He made a home for himself in the Barossa in a little cave along a creek, which is now famously known as Jacob's Creek. It's not just a label, it is a creek. And Mengi lived in that cave and spent 2 years wandering what is now the Barossa zone, which encompasses the Barossa Valley and Eden Valley as the Barossa region, and did a complete survey of it. And he was obviously very interested in soil composition and minerals and things, but he also mapped where the water was. Being here for several years, he got to see the seasons come and go, and he was writing letters back to his boss, George Angus, who was still in the UK at that point. And when he's writing letters to someone who hasn't yet been here, he's trying to do two things. He's trying to describe what he sees, and he's trying to inspire with what may be done here. And his first letter back to Angus, you can almost read an excitement in it. It's, if not romantic, certainly a poetic letter. And the opening line just says, "Dear Mr. Angus, sir, I write to inform you that your lands are and will prove to be the kernel around which this province will grow and prosper." So he can see the Barossa as this food bowl with all of this agricultural potential. And he talks about that agricultural potential. He goes on in the letter to talk about envisaging wheat fields that will stretch to the horizon, orchards that will rival the empire. And then he also mentions, almost just in passing, that the Barossa and district has the potential to be one of the great wine producing regions of the world. So obviously in any agricultural pursuit, all of those just mentioned, it's all about the geography. So on the foundation of that, when Angus was bringing these settlers and they were establishing their hoofs along the rivers and things like that, they were growing those mixed crops. They were growing the cereal grains, they were growing the orchards, and they were planting vines. Families started to specialise. Christian Auricht on this block settled here in 1842. He planted vines the following year in 1843. And vines obviously became significant to him, because when he arrived in the province of South Australia, it's recorded on the ship, who was it coming and what trades and things they brought to the new colony. And he's listed as a blacksmith. In earlier recordings of the colony, he's listed as a blacksmith and a farmer. But by the time of his untimely end, he didn't live to be an old man. He was only at Langmeil for 18 years. He fell from a horse and wagon and had his neck broken, and that brought his life to an end. But at the point of his death, he'd been growing grapes here on the property for 17 years. And he's referred to as a grape grower, because that had become his passion. Our great privilege at Langmeil is that, along with the buildings and things that survive, we've still got just under 3.5 acres of Christian's original vineyard. We referred to it as the Freedom Vineyard, because these people had come here for their freedom of faith. There is a book of the family history of the Auricht family, and it's called From Persecution to Freedom. So when we needed to name that vineyard and give the wine a name, it was your dad, wasn't it? It was James's dad, Richard, who said, that's what these wines are about. That's their foundation. We'll call it the Freedom Vineyard. And to this day, we still make a single vineyard wine from that. Like the rest of the community and the generations, those vines have stood the test of time. They've become incredibly resilient. They've become very well practiced. They're very good at what they do. If you talk about the artisans, those who really craft something, you can craft some really exceptional wines from the earliest living history in the Barossa.
And what is actually amazing is that, it's our understanding and the belief that the Freedom, 1843 Shiraz, is actually the oldest surviving sort of Shiraz vineyard in the world. And one of the things I think the Freedom does is it really puts a spotlight on the Barossa overall, because, we do have probably one of the largest sort of land holdings, not just our family, but the families of the Barossa, of some of the oldest, pre-phylloxera vines anywhere on the planet. And so, when you're thinking of wanting to try things of interest, I love, Dad was a bit of a romantic in a lot of ways, and he'd always talk about the Freedom, being, what is a glass of history. To actually taste something from a vine planted by the first European settlers. And within what we call the Barossa Old Vine Charter, any vineyard that is 125 years or older, we classify as ancestor vines, purely because these vineyards were planted by the first or second of the European settlers to the region.
So you mentioned that the property was derelict, but how did those vines survive if the property here was being ignored?
But one of the, I suppose, one of the fascinating things about old vines, ancestor vines, or centenarian vines, like 100-year-old vines, is often they are planted in the right place. When we talk old vines, we often say things like it's not just that old vines make great wine, it's because these vines have made great wine, they become old. So if you imagine where that vineyard is planted and what variety they've chosen is always excelled, and often the case is that, you know, in an area like the Barossa, they're planted in an area whereby the vines themselves have worked very hard to get their roots right down near the supply of water, like the water table. So, you know, when you consider that the vineyard itself hadn't been pruned for 10 or 12 years, it survived. You know, it managed to get its way through because it did have a consistent water supply. But the other thing is that when we first took ownership or custodianship of this property, you know, it was my brother and our uncle Chris and my dad's second cousin Carl that actually went in and pruned that vineyard, because you imagine after 10 years a vine really shoots from the end buds first, so it sprawled, you know, like a vine. You know, they're called a vine for a reason, and the whole thing is they sprawl. And so you have to be careful. So you've got to cut it back and keep cutting it back. And when you cut it back, every now and then you're lucky a little water shoot will shoot out closer to the main trunk of the vine, and you just go, happy days, and you spur that. And you know it won't get fruit next year, but it'll set that vine up well into the future. And so that's what it did. So over, you know, probably 5-6 years of pruning, taking each vine as it comes, have managed to reshape and bring that vine back to life. And I suppose if there's one interesting thing with that, it also is that, you know, my brother Paul and myself, you know, it's our role as sort of these custodians or caretakers of this vineyard is to get that old vine through to the next generation to tender. And so again, you know, it's very well managed and looked after. Yeah, they're all just extensions of your family now.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Freedom Shiraz Vineyard? You know, it's a single block clearly. Where is it at? How is it compared to the Terroir River? Is it on the banks too? What's the soil behind us, the climate, things like that? A little bit more.
So I suppose the Freedom Vineyard is planted on what is the sort of the banks of the river, and when you dig down, you know you're going to have certain sort of like loams and purely because you know that over hundreds of thousands of years, flooding builds up and builds up. And what is surprising though is that there's red clays there over like limestone. So when you look at a lot of some of these older ancient soils of the Barossa, they were seabed at some point. So you've got this limestone, and then you have like also these like red sands, and then you have like red, like not red but gravel, and then you've got another layer of red and then gravel. And so there's actually all these layers. And when we talk about old vines, I suppose one of the things is that because one, they'll have a very good surface root area because obviously they want to take as much advantage of any of the summer rains that we get, but also because of that taproot, because it's had to drive the root, drive to survive, down, it goes down through all of that strata, and then you get these side roots that sort of work off into the different layers of areas. This is where that sort of complexity and the layers of flavour come from. So, and again, for us, depending on the season, the Freedom Vineyard can go anywhere from like 1 tonne to the acre, up to 2, maybe if we're lucky, I think we've seen like just over 2 tonne to the acre in more of a wetter year. So the vines themselves, they tend to naturally find their balance, which is really interesting. And when you actually look over, I think one of the great things about single vineyard wines like the Freedom is that when you do step back and you take a snapshot, from like 1997, through, you can see how the wine's evolved, especially winemaking, through Paul's understanding of that vineyard, the different sort of, interpretations of using oak, knowing you only get that one shot a year, and because it's a small, patch, just changing oak's a big thing, because, you don't want to, if that barrel doesn't work, it's like, oh my gosh, we've just lost 30 cases of, rare wine. So that whole thing, it just takes time and adapt that all to come. So I think if anything about that, when you look at that vertical, you can not only see that sort of winemaking evolution and how Paul has sort of adapted as he's gone along, making some, the best wines of his life right now. And then you look at also that vintage variation. You start to see some of those things that happened in that year. Obviously, if there was a year that wasn't up to scratch, you just don't make it. If there's one thing about reputation in the wine industry, it's very hard earned and it takes decades to build it, but it doesn't take long to lose it. So, it's actually sometimes the ones that you don't make that help to make your reputation. So, so I find that fascinating, and to actually have a look at it and actually have that snapshot of time is quite good.
As a winemaker, what do you do to really allow these ancestral vines to really come to full expression in your vines? In your vines, sorry.
Yeah. It's always important to know, because I think sometimes people, just because they see a wine on the shelf, just thinks it's there all the time. And what we have to realise is that you get one shot a year to make these wines. So really to understand the vineyard, understand the fruit that's coming through, you've got all this seasonal variation to take into account. It genuinely takes years. I always say it's not like your grandmother's, Sunday roast that she's perfected over 50 years. You get that one shot. So initially, we had no money, so we were buying ex-Penfolds barrels for around $50. We'd scrape the tart trade out to try to get some new oak, and this was mainly American oak back then. That was the dominant oak of the time. And then, over the years, it sort of refined, and as we then reinvested the money that we made back into the business, I think it was around 2000 that we introduced French oak, and it was mainly because it was a tighter grain, it was a little bit more subtle. And then with that, he then started to be able to have a budget to hand select the barrels that he wanted specifically for the Freedom. And so over the years, he has sort of, I suppose, identified when he wants to pick the fruit, because there's one thing to get like what you would say a sugar ripeness, a level of Beaumet that's high enough to go, right, the sugar's there, but it's another one to pick it when the flavour's there. So understanding when those flavours come on, and that can vary from year to year as well. So really it has been just this time that he's invested, and then just having that memory and the capacity to know when he's picked it, the seasonal conditions, the similarities between vintage, and then refining that. So, his journey of making the Freedom now, nearly, over the last 28 years, that experience is just invaluable and really underpins, I suppose the pedigree of the wine itself. So it is a journey, and a journey of time and pursuits and and passion.
The principles that he's applying to, observe as the fruit developed, to see what's going on, with the sugars, but really also when that skin is there, the flavors are there, the right oak that goes with it. Those principles that he's applying, are they the same for these three wines we have, or are each level of wine, as you have the Valley Floor, the Orphan, and the Freedom, are there different nuances in winemaking that you need depending on the type of vineyard or the style of wine that you're dealing with?
I definitely think there's certain nuances that Paul takes for the specific wines that he makes. I will say though, from the Freedom and across the Orphan Bank and the Valley Floor, they're all traditional winemaking style. So, we are, selecting all those vineyards separately because we have the Freedom, which is single vineyard, Orphan Bank, which is a blend of old vines, and then we have the Valley Floor, which is actually a blend of vineyards from across the district as well. So with that in mind, he's picking all these vineyards separately, and then he is open fermenting them and basket. Oh, sorry. Here we go. Paul can nearly tell about himself.
We've been talking about you for an hour, and here he comes.
When we grew up in the Barossa, my brother and I, there was one high school. There's a little primary school in each towns, and we actually, it was interesting. We grew up in an era around what was called the vine pool era, around the 1980s, and it was a significant time. A lot of people don't realise really the Australian wine industry and how it became prominent on the world stage. We actually had been, as a region, growing grapes and making wine for something like 130 years, until really we were starting to sell fortified to England in the 1930s. We were actually one of the largest suppliers. In fact, we supplied more fortified wine to England than the Portuguese in the 1930s. And then slowly, as the palates changed, and fortified market was dropping, Australia sort of diminished and disappeared from the export market. And then you had a lot of family wine businesses until, in my mind, what happened is, as the companies tried to get bigger, one way of getting bigger is that they went public. And as soon as you go public, you're actually making money without selling any wine. People are investing in it. And so therefore all this new money came into the wine industry. And then the commercialisation of wine, so branding became a big thing. And so, we had a few different brands that were created, like Barossa Pearl, out of Orlando, which was a sweet sparkling white wine in the 70s, and that took off. The introduction of rosé, so like Matousse rosé, went from 0 to 60,000 cases in 6 months in Australia, and all of a sudden people thought, wow, this is something to invest in. And then as that one family business went public, they controlled it for about probably 10 years until someone took it over, because once you're public, you're for sale. Anyone can come in really and buy it. And then other couple family businesses then tried to compete with that, and so they went public, and all of a sudden, what happened is we had the introduction of irrigation in the 70s in Australia, technology out of Israel, so all of a sudden you could manage yields, so it wasn't so dependent, when you have Mother Nature doing this, you could actually even that out and you could maintain yields, so that helped to supply consistency of fruit. And then they introduced like machine harvesters, machine pruners, a big vinomatic, so all of a sudden it became commercial. And at the same time you had a wine show program, and the wine show program really was rewarding quality. So, they would look at a wine and they would look for its brightness and look for the aromatics and the taste, and it's like, wow, this is really representative of that variety, therefore we will give that a gold medal. And so for those that are wanting to increase sales, they would go to the wine shows and they would compare their wine to what the judges were giving gold medals for. And so it started to produce like a quality, a level of quality. And so therefore the quality of what we were doing was this, but because of the commerciality of wine and all this money, the price was doing this. And by the 1980s, because we hadn't been selling any wine overseas, there was no export market, they were just cannibalizing each other, and it was a race to the bottom, and it pushed everything down. So you imagine these family businesses, the only way to compete with these big, public companies is they had to take all the money out of the bank that they've accrued over generations as a good farming sort of business, I suppose, to try to compete with them. And then I think it was 1985 in the Barossa, a ton of Shiraz was $150. And so the growers were telling their kids that stay in school, there's no future in the region for making wine anymore. And so Paul and I were growing up in that time. So there was nothing exciting, there was no export, there was no sort of dramatic sort of thing to enter into. And then really for us, we were fortunate, and I know I talked before around the elders, because during that downturn, a lot of farmers were wanting to get out of the wine industry, so the developers started to come in and they could smell it and they just go, do you know what, let's just subdivide it. And so there was a big plan to literally subdivide the whole valley floor into 5-acre farmlets. And it was a friend of the Barossa, and an artist called Rod Schubert. It was his 40th birthday at the time, and a few of the locals came together and they said, what are we going to do? If we don't do something, we are going to lose our entire viticultural history of 140 years. And so then they formed what was the Barossa Region Residents Association, and they had to lobby state government and local councils. And they said, look, what we need is time. The wine industry has always done this, supply, demand. And at the moment, it's down here, but we feel we have a plan to create more prosperity back into the Barossa. And they were very lucky. They had a planning minister based in South Australia called Susan Lenihan, and she agreed to come and meet these families, and the families would take her out and explain to them, what the wine industry was about and how this works, and the threats that the community was under. And she had the foresight, and more so the will and want to actually help. So she ticked a box and said there'll be no development in the Barossa for 2 years. So, there was a lot of struggling farmers. They got upset because they could have sold some land for retirement. But in the end, they said, right, well, for developers, we need to compromise. We'll draw some town boundaries. So drew town boundaries. And then from those town boundaries, they said, right, the population growth can happen within the town boundaries where the infrastructure is, but more importantly, it is to protect the agricultural assets that surround the region. And so that really underpinned our future and really the start of what we have today. What was interesting, though, is that at the same time, the Australian wine industry had invited masters of wine from England out to Australia to show them, the wines that they were creating, and they came and they were absolutely blown away with obviously the quality, because through the wine show circuit it really sort of got everybody sort of on the same hymn sheet, as you can say, and the quality was outstanding, and because of the commercialisation, the pricing was incredible, and so they went back to England and they said to all the major wine buyers, you need to go to South Australia or to Australia and taste some of the wines that they have on offer. And then they came over and they said, all right, we'll go and have a look. And they tasted and they went, holy moly, this is amazing. And they said, all right, so how much have you got of this? And they said, about 5,000 cases. Okay, and how much is it? Oh, it's about, like $5 a bottle. This is way back when it was 48 cents to the dollar. And then all of a sudden they said, all right, well, yeah, we'll buy all that. And what else have you got? And all of a sudden, the world exploded for Australian wine, and particularly the Barossa. Barossa Shiraz had become on people's radars, and the quality of the wine, as they are today, are outstanding. And so in 1985, that tonne of Shiraz was $150, and by 1990, 5 years later, that same tonne was $2,000 a tonne, and the whole world had just turned. Today we're really highlighting Shiraz, because Shiraz and Barossa are connected. If you wonder really where the New World home of Shiraz is, it is Barossa. I think we as a region could claim to be the one area that has really brought Shiraz back to life. And it's not because it was unique, it's because it naturally rose to the top after 180 years of growing grapes and making wine. And the three wines we picked out here all have their own unique individual story. And while, in the winemaking process, they are made exactly the same as far as, individual vineyard parcels all coming in separately. I think the one thing that Valley Floor really talks to as far as vineyard source is because we do have around 30 parishes across the district. It highlights the uniqueness of the Barossa, because we can pick parcels of Shiraz from the southern end of the Barossa, sort of like early to mid-February. And then you can pick Shiraz sort of along the western ridge, heading up towards the northern end of the Barossa, and then along the foothills, where the cool air comes down through the gully breezes, and then up over the range, up into Eden Valley, and you could be picking Shiraz sort of early to late April. So, you are looking at a window potentially of anywhere between 6 to 8 to 10 weeks of picking Shiraz across the breadth and depth of the region at those sugar levels and physiological ripeness levels. And that to me speaks volumes of why the Barossa has risen to be one of the great wine regions of the world, and why Shiraz has risen with it. The one thing I always love about Valley Floor is, one, it's accessible. Like in premium wine regions around the world, sometimes people are priced out of enjoying the experience, and Valley Floor is very much a wine that, while we open ferment it, we basket press it, we invest a couple of years in oak maturation, it has everything that you want from great Barossa wine. We've also made sure that we feel it's priced so that there's accessibility, but importantly also the price we ask is one that we think is fair to be a sustainable wine. And when we talk sustainability, we're not just talking about farming and agriculture, we're talking about economic sustainability. And I always love the fact that when people enjoy Valley Floor, they go, man, this is great. For the money, this is amazing. But what they don't realise is that the value chain all the way through to the farmer is there. So one of the things is, and as John spoke to, we have something around 550 to 600 families that still grow grapes for a living across the region. And that enables us to actually source fruit from across the breadth and the depth. As a family in the Barossa, we don't have to own all of our own vineyards. We can actually support those farmers on their land. And the idea being is not just to let them survive, but thrive on that property. And if you pay them well, one, you don't need a contract. You don't need to handcuff them to your business. You just pay them well and they want to stay a part of that business. And if you continue to look after them, the likelihood of their kids selling fruit to our kids is far greater, because what we've done is we've enabled them and empowered them to have a choice whether they want to stay on their farm, and or if the children want to continue to pursue that sort of pursuit. That's the thing they love, if they love farming and being with family. So the Valley Floor genuinely, I think, represents what is Barossa Shiraz, not only as a wine to drink, but also as I suppose a cultural aspect and of community as well. We always talk about the rising tide lifts all ships, and Valley Floor definitely does that. So that's a great wine. The Orphan Bank, John, do you want to talk about the Orphan Bank?
I guess the Orphan is it's all of those things, but it's also across generations. It's about preserving those earliest vineyards of the Barossa again. And it comes back to the original village of Langmeil. This is an example. It is multiple vineyard, not the same range of vineyards as the Valley Floor. It's rather select in terms of age, because it fits within the old vine charter. But the foundation vineyard that gives its name to its rather unusual name, the Orphan Bank. But it shows, again, Langmeil's commitment to the old vineyards of the valley. When Langmeil was a village, as I said, Christian Auricht on this block wasn't the only person to be planting vines. And about half a mile down Langmeil Road, there's a little housing estate now called Langmeil Estate. Nothing to do with us, it just bears the same name as the village. But that too was a vineyard in the time of the village, right up until 2006. And it's another case of us not owning, but buying the fruit from the grower. And it was 1850s planted, Shiraz. And in 2004, the owner of the vineyard gave us 2 years' notice. He said that that struggle every year, which you can appreciate, of having to hand prune old vines and hand pick your fruit and hoping that the fruit's going to set well and it's going to ripen and then you're going to get good dollars for it, etc. As opposed to the offer to be able to turn that into residential land, because it's one of those little patches that was still within the residential zoning of the Barossa. So he gave us 2 years' notice that the vineyard was going to be going, and that we could have the fruit in 2005 and 2006, and once it had been picked in 2006, they were planting houses there instead. We can completely appreciate their position, but likewise we thought it was a great shame that another of the old parcels of the Barossa was going to go. We didn't have anything on this property growing down along the edge of the river, so over those 2 years, which sounds like a long period of time, but it was really 2-3 month windows while the vines were dormant, we tried to save some of those vines. And it wasn't about saving genetics. That's easily done. You just take some cuttings and replant. We wanted to save those vines that had been toiling, along the river here for 160 odd years at that point. So we literally dug up and moved just over 300 vines over those 2 years. We used a device that was adapted from what you use for moving mature age trees. So if you can imagine like a collar of hydraulic spades that you literally wrap around the vine and dig into the soil. It didn't bring the plant, it brought half a tonne of its own soil and a big ball of its feeder roots with it. And one by one we brought them down the road and relocated them. And we moved over those 2 years just over 300 vines, 340 vines. We lost 10%. So we had a pretty good success rate. And it's like a little bank of orphan vines, if you like, growing on the banks of the North Para of the river down there. So that's the foundation vineyard and the foundation name for the wine. And again, like the valley floor, but on a smaller scale, bringing select parcels which represent the older vineyards of the Barossa, and when I say the Barossa, the broader Barossa zone, so it's got floor of the valley, it's got some Eden Valley parcels in it as well, and again an old vine representation on a smaller scale of that same story, if you like, as something like the valley floor.
Wow, it is so hard to be quiet when you are talking about these things. That is phenomenal.
Unbelievable. What's the average age on that of the vines?
The average age, it fits within the old vine charter. So it's 70 to 100 years they fit in there. So I think that they average out in their 90s. Yeah, across the different parcels.
Wow.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting about the Orphan Bank Shiraz is, again, it's the fact that someone cherished old living plants and wanted to save them, and the thing also is, like, we didn't have a lot of money, so while we were going, bugger it, we're just going to move that whole vineyard a kilometre down the road and replant it. We did something like 1,000 kilometres by tractor, just one vine at a time. And Jonathan actually said, well, geez, if you really want to try to make some, recoup some money, orphan them out, And so we actually found that all those vines, we sold them. So someone come and bought a vine for $500 and become a parent of an orphan vine. And then every year we'd send them a bottle of Orphan Bank in the post, and then we'd invite them to come and pick their vine, then we'd feed them, make sure they were well watered, I think is the term, and but they had this connection. And so what we did find is people like us, like-minded people that go, oh my God, you're trying to save this incredibly old vineyard. We want to be a part of that. How can we help? And we could have sold those vines over and over and over again. And then after 10 years, we said, hey, look, that's enough. We can't just keep giving money away now. But you're a part and connected to the winery, forever. And so yeah,
it was really crowdfunding ahead of its time. It was, this is what we're doing. If you'd like to be a part of that, you can adopt a vine. It was really a fostering program. They fostered a vine for 10 years.
Yeah. So
I would have done that.
Yeah. There you go.
And we could have sold them so many times. But importantly, what the Orphan Bank also has to represent, though, is the reason why we did it. Because if the old vines didn't make great wine, why would you move them? When I look back in the history of the Barossa, old vines only really became a conversation really in the late 70s into the 80s. And one of the reasons it did is because of the downturn in the wine industry. A lot of farmers were looking to rip out their vineyard. And it was only then, and it is the Robert O'Callaghan's of the world, and it was, the Bob McLeans and Carl Lindners of the world. I think St. Hallett was the first wine company in Australia to bring out a wine marketed as Old Block Shiraz. And it was all about these were old vines, and I think Carl jokingly said at one point, I've got to walk up and down the rows with an axe, once a year to get them to, just to threaten them so they produce something. And so that was the start of that conversation. And a lot of growers were growing grapes. They didn't realise they were growing, old vine grapes. And a lot of people didn't even know phylloxera, what was phylloxera, and why, and then understanding the reason why we have these incredibly old vineyards. And so that whole old vine story really started out of that vine pull era and reminding people what they have, and before you go and pull them out, you have something really rare in the world of wine. And so it was only just sort of probably in the last 10 years the Barossa actually developed the Old Vine Charter. And we did that because, one, we've been talking old vines, but we never asked the question, when is a vine old? Like, how old does a vine have to be old? And the other reason that we wanted to develop the charter is that there is no legal definition for old vine. Like, I've been to the States quite a few times, and I can see a $7.99 bottle of old vine Zinfandel. Now, I'm not sure how old those vines are, but there's a claim on the label that they're old vine. So in the Barossa, to give some guide around this old vine terminology, we created the Barossa Old Vine Charter. Now, it started from Robert Hill Smith at Yalumba and Brian Walsh, who worked for Robert, and they asked the question, and they had the Yalumba Old Vine Charter. And then the Regional Association, which is a volunteer organisation, it was taken to them and said, guys, we need to endorse this. We need to be promoting this as part of our heritage and part of our story. And so they created the 4 chapters of the Old Vine Charter. And any vineyard that's between 35 and 69 is classified as old vine. When a vine is around 35 years of age, they feel they're quite mature, the roots are very well integrated into that soil, the consistency is definitely there. In fact, in some areas, I think of Europe, they start pulling them out at 35 because of the yield, so they'd start to replant. Then we have 70-year-old vines to 99, and we call them survivor vines. And the reason they're called survivor vines is they actually survived the vine pull era of the 1980s. They managed to get through those dark days and the threats of, I suppose, a bounty to a grower if they pulled those vines out back in 1985. Then we have centenarian, 100 to 124, 100 being that milestone. And then we have 125 years plus, and that is ancestor vines because they were planted by the first or the second of the European settlers. So I think, as John said earlier, to actually be able to then, go and prune a vine that, generations of people had pruned before you, that's just a privilege. And then to make wine from it and share that with the wine-loving, the wine-loving world is just amazing. One of the Barossa's elders, I suppose, within my generation, a gentleman called Robert O'Callaghan from Rockford Wines, he often said, actually, it's not necessarily about being a local, it's about being a Barossan. And what is a Barossan? And a Barossan is someone that sort of, I suppose, respects the past by protecting its future. And because we are all here, because we've been built, we are building from the shoulders of those that have come before us. And so that's really our I suppose, opportunity to build on that for the future generations to come. So,
absolutely, there's a real sense of custodianship, and whilst technically people own vineyards, those vineyards, some of the old vineyards of the Barossa have been here in the ground for those 6 coming into 7th generations. So, that's what I find, and I know James does too, I find really amazing when you look at those old plants. To think that a vine is, a century plus old, that sounds impressive because we don't live that long. But in the plant world, that's not particularly impressive. Plants can live incredible ages. What's impressive about those old vines is that someone has had to tend them every year. And so you've had a generation who have hand pruned and hand picked those vines and until their very end, until they've passed on, and then the next generation has done the same thing, and the next generation has. So the vines have stayed, the generations have come and gone, and if we do our bit while we're here, hopefully those vines will continue to stay for generations that come after us as well.
Yeah. Mm. They're like a living sculpture.
Absolutely.
Of generations.
Yeah.
And you can sort of see the time pass just through the old spurs that have died and the new arms that have come on and
how the vines have been pruned.
Yeah.
I can remember going out into the vineyard with my grandfather. He was the head vigneron for what was then Orlando Grant. And when vines have lost their leaves in the winter time before you start pruning, they're a scraggly mess. There's canes sticking out in all directions. And yet the different pruners in the team, they would look at the vines and they would have a go at each other. They'd known who'd pruned that row the year before because they all had their own style, and they'd say, I'm not pruning that. Alan, that must have been you. You can deal with that, sort of thing. And there is that. There's that individual human character that they've left their mark on those old vines, each generation.
Yeah. And I think, so there's a couple different methods of pruning, obviously, but, if you look at, say, rod and spur pruning, I was always taught, you always take the spur first. The spur is really looking to tomorrow, because the spur drives what will be the next rod and the next spur and shapes the vine for the following year. And then the rod, which really produces all the fruit, where you sort of get your income from, that's secondary. Mm. And I think that's always an interesting thing. It's sort of like looking at your, shaping your future first, and then the money is second. And I've always loved, you do what you do it well, and you do it because you love it, and you don't worry about the money will come somehow. And I think, when you're looking at rod and spurring, I love that thought, thinking of tomorrow first, and then the money second, and then it all seems to work through.
And you came here in 96, you bought that property, you knew it came with that vineyard, you had to do the careful pruning for 5-6 years to get it there. What now? What is in your heart? What does it mean to the family to now produce wine from the oldest vineyard in the world?
So when you sort of go to the world claiming to have what is believed to be the world's oldest surviving Shiraz vineyard, I have to say it is a double-edged sword. It's sort of like, it's a big claim, and to be honest, I think the one thing I like about it the most is it does shine a light, not just necessarily on Langmeil, but on the region, on the Barossa. Because then when people go, oh my gosh, it's in the Barossa, or who else has got old vines in the Barossa? It starts to then, people start to go, right, so that's the first sort of focal point, but then they start to look broader across the district. We believe we're the home of the world's oldest surviving Mataro vineyard, Grenache vineyard, Cabernet vineyard, Riesling, Semillon. It's not just our vineyard at all. But the other thing is we've been very privileged, I suppose, to be able to also retain clones and of certain varieties that may not even exist anymore. And so as a family, again, I think John alluded to this earlier, and it's not just as a family but as a region, we have to do our bit to get it to the next generation, and then we're going to let them worry about it. So
it's a shared joy, and it's a shared burden.
What is what you want them to know about Langmeil when they're drinking that wine, when they're drinking one of these 3 bottles, or all 3 hopefully, that as they can progress through it? What do you want them to know in just a very brief answer that will stick in the memory?
Do you have a brief
I'm
answer?
going to have either one of them.
Sorry, I'm not familiar with the concept of brief answers.
Langmeil wants to become recognised globally as a fine wine producer, a producer of some of the oldest vineyards or wines from the oldest vines from the world, but also a steward and a custodian, not only for us but for the region, for the Barossas at large.
Well, James's philosophy is true to the region, true to the community, and true to ourselves.